I'd like to welcome you all to this special symposium on guest workers. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Gretchen Purser, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology here at Syracuse University. And I'm also one of the members of a labor studies group. And this is a group of interdisciplinary faculty that began meeting towards the end of last year through PARCC, which is the Program for the Advancement of Research on Conflict and Collaboration, to try to promote greater attention to issues of labor movements, and working class politics here at Syracuse University. So I want to start by thanking PARCC, that institute, and particularly to the director of PARCC, Catherine Girard, for hosting our group and for sponsoring the symposium series that we'll be putting together. And for generously co-sponsoring this event, I'd also like to thank the Departments of African American Studies, the Department of Anthropology, thank you, Rachel, the Department of Geography, the Department of History, the Department of Political Science, and the Department of Sociology. So thanks to all of them. So as I've just kind of... So as I just suggested, this is the first part in what will be a 4-part series on labor studies taking place this academic year. So before I turn to today's extremely exciting panel, I want to make a plug for the next event, just to get it on your radars and perhaps on your calendars so that you come. So the next symposium is going to be on the topic of community labor coalitions. It's going to be held on Friday, October 28th from 1 to 3 p.m. in 500 Hall of Languages. It's another exciting lineup of academics and activists featuring people such as Janice Fine, who's from the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University, and she's a well-known expert on low-wage labor, immigrant organizing, and also worker centers. And if you don't know what a worker center is now, you will by the end of today. It's also going to feature Ian McDonald, a political scientist from York University, and a scholar who's written quite a bit on labor community organizing, labor community alliances. And finally, it's going to feature Jeffrey Bellamy, the executive director of Syracuse Alliance for a New Economy here in central New York. So today what I'd like to do is just start this by introducing our panel, which is extremely exciting. Before I do so, let me just say one thing about why we've chosen this topic. The reason we chose this topic is because the people in the group had an interest in putting together an event on migrant workers, on excluded workers, that is, workers who are deprived of traditional labor rights and the right to collectively organize. And we're trying to follow up on a case that occurred last year at the New York State Fair, which, as some of you are probably aware, is taking place right now here in Syracuse. So the reason we've timed this event for the first week of classes, which is not so opportune, but we've done it, is so that it can coincide with the fair. And you'll hear more about why we're focusing on fair workers, amusement workers, with the panelists. So let me introduce the panelists to you. The first speaker is going to be David Griffith, who is a senior scientist and professor at East Carolina University with a joint appointment in the Institute for Coastal Science and Policy and the Department of Anthropology. He's the author of several books, most recently a book that's entitled American Guestworkers. I'm holding it up for you. I told him I'd give him a plug. Jamaicans and Mexicans in the United States. He's been conducting research on managed migration, that is guest worker programs, since the early 1980s. And his talk today is going to focus predominantly on managed migration between Sinaloa, Mexico, and North Carolina, with an emphasis on Mexican women who are working in the mid-Atlantic blue crab industry. The next speaker is going to be Rachel Micah Jones, and she is the founder and executive director of Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, which is the Center for Migrant Rights. And this is an innovative transnational organization that operates on both sides of the US-Mexico border. They're working to organize and improve the working conditions for migrant workers inside of the United States. So prior to founding CDM, Rachel worked with the Migrant Farm Worker Unit of Floral Rural Legal Services. She has a JD, and she's currently teaching in the International and Comparative Law Clinic at the University of Maryland School of Law. Our next speaker, I'm particularly excited to introduce you to our next speaker because his journey has been very difficult to get here to Syracuse. So we're particularly lucky to have him with us. His name is Martin Davila Venegas, and he's a retired H2B guest worker and labor rights activist. Over the past decade, he has worked in landscaping and construction in Colorado, as well as the traveling carnival and fair industry in New York. After suffering a variety of abuses in the recruitment of H2B employment, and while on the worksite in the United States, he became an advocate for migrant workers' rights in 2008, when he became involved in this legal action, a legal case that you'll be hearing more about called Dreamland. Since then, he's become a leader of the Migrant Defense Committee, and this is what he'll be predominantly talking to you about today. And this is a group of migrant worker leaders dedicated to defending the rights of migrant workers in the US through peer education and support. Finally, I want to introduce you to Rebecca Fuentes. Rebecca Fuentes is the coordinator of the Worker Center of Central New York, a local member-based organization that supports low-wage workers and immigrant workers to fight for economic justice through education, organizing, and public policy advocacy. She's been involved in social change work and activism for a number of years, including with the CNY Immigration Task Force and Solidarity of Central New York. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to the panelists, and we're going to begin with David Griffith. Let's give him a round of applause.
Well, thanks, Gretchen, and thank you all for coming, and thanks to all the groups that sponsored this. I'm quite pleased to be here, quite honored to be here. I'm going to talk mostly about migration between a few communities in Sinaloa, Mexico, which is in northwest Mexico, and North Carolina, a managed migration program that brings women up to pick the meat out of blue crabs. And but before I get to that, I'm going to talk a little about, give you kind of an overview of managed migration or temporary foreign worker programs in the world and in North America in particular. All around the world, these temporary foreign worker programs have been expanding. More and more countries are seeing them as an alternative to undocumented migration as well as human trafficking, and a more humane alternative to this, although we know from empirical work done among managed migrants that it's often not a very humane alternative to human trafficking. What these temporary worker programs are is a kind of manifestation of what we call these flexible labor regimes that are becoming more common in advanced capitalist countries around the world. This is where labor is reproductive and productive labor is separated from one another. They only bring the productive members of the family into the countries to work. It's also labor that's highly responsive to labor demand. They're very mobile. They can move around a lot and respond to any kind of labor demand that develops. Like after Hurricane Katrina, there was a whole bunch of people that went down there to respond to that labor demand. And now, in my hometown, after Hurricane Irene, same thing. Now, these worker programs are really one way that nations become more integrated with one another. And a couple of examples of this are that China has been sending more and more managed migrants to Canada, and at the same time, they're investing in Canadian agriculture where these managed migrants work, and in Canadian mining and the petroleum industry in Canada. And Canada then recently approved China as a tourist destination, so it's okay for their citizens to go to China, or to go to Canada. Now, in Mexico and the United States, of course, their economies have become much more integrated after NAFTA, although they've been highly integrated for many, many years. But NAFTA, what it did was really disrupted the coffee economy. So a lot of coffee-growing communities started sending migrants to the United States. The coffee economy was starting to crumble a little before NAFTA, really in the late 1980s, but NAFTA kind of gave it a decisive blow, and then a lot more migrants came. And managed migration was seen as one way that Mexican state could deal with these unemployed coffee growers. Now, these programs, they often develop in response to crises like wars or, for example, or special labor market needs like the building of the Olympic grounds in Vancouver, Canada in 2010. That stimulated a big growth in the expansion of the guest worker program in Canada. But once these crises are over, these programs tend to stay in effect. The Bracero program, which was the biggest guest worker program we had with Mexico, at its height brought in about 400,000 workers a year from Mexico to work in agriculture in the western United States. But it started in during World War II in response to the labor scarcity of people going into the war effort. But it continued until 1964, so it really stayed on for 20 years after the war. Now, the other thing about temporary foreign workers is that their anti-immigration forces also often find them okay because they come in without their families. They're contracted to work with just one employer. They are often isolated from the general public. And so they say, well, they're responding to certain economic needs in this country, and so it's okay with us to bring them in, because then they go home at the end of the season, right? And these programs are also particularly well suited to the construction of rural labor markets. Rural labor markets historically have been constructed with fairly coercive methods, including slavery, serfdom, debt peonage, and now today, managed migration. Rural labor forces often require recruiting workers from far away. Locals won't take these jobs under current conditions of work and pay. Many of the rural jobs are seasonal, and they're in remote locations, and so they require housing, and most managed migration programs have housing associated with them that is also used as a tool of labor control and controlling that workforce. And then importing foreign workers and other workers from around the world allows employers to manipulate kind of ethnic stereotypes about workers for their production goals. This quote actually came from an upstate New York grower. He said, Jamaicans are better at picking apples. Guatemalans are better at picking vegetables because they're shorter and they're closer to the ground. And Jamaicans are a little taller, so they can pick apples better. Now, in the United States right now, we actually have a whole bunch of different guest worker programs. The one that a lot of people know about is the one that brings in engineers, highly skilled engineers from most from Asia. But I'm not going to talk about them. I talk principally about, or I study principally low-skill programs. This would be the H2A and H2B program. Now, the H2A is principally for agricultural purposes, but you'll see I'm going to give a list of other kinds of crops and job titles that come in under H2A visas, and you'll see that it doesn't just include agriculture. It includes other occupations, and also when big rock stars come to the United States, they often are issued an H2A visa. So it does have some, highly skilled musicians, professional sports people, stuff like that. H2B is supposedly for non-agricultural seasonal occupations. Racehorse attendance is one of the big ones. Mid-Atlantic seafood processing used to be a bigger one than it is today because the whole seafood industry is kind of going downhill because of imports of seafood. And the numbers of H2A and H2B have been fluctuating over time, but slowly creeping up, even though they haven't quite reached the levels of the Bracero program. Now, I'm going to give a couple of slides about the certification data that comes out of the Department of Labor. These are employers that were certified to utilize H2A workers. There were in their database for 2010 were 7,400 plus or minus employers. They were certified in 53 different locations. That's every state, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and Washington, D.C. They requested over 100,000 workers, and they were certified, that is, they were allowed to bring in about 94,000. It was 6,700 employers were certified to bring in workers. Now, all of these workers weren't brought in. They often ask for more workers than they need. They get certified for more, and then they only bring in a handful. The most important H2A states, North Carolina has the most employers, and most of those workers are concentrated in tobacco. And that's true also for Kentucky and Virginia, where the bulk of the workers work in tobacco. Now, in North Carolina, some of them work in this Fraser fir Christmas tree industry out in the western part of the state as well. Idaho brings in about 4,300 workers to be irrigators or to build irrigation systems and manage irrigation systems. Some of them are shepherds. They tend sheep. A lot of these actually don't come from the Caribbean or Latin America. They come from, they're Basque. They come from Spain. Texas employs about 3,000, and they work in general farm work. And then New York really is a large employer. And about a third of these are in apples. It's hard to tease out because a lot of these are just under the heading general farm work. And so a lot of these a third specified that they were in apples around, and most of that's in upstate New York or along the Hudson River Valley. Now these are some examples of crops and job titles that are brought in under H2A. And you can see that the crops aren't all crops. I mean, alpaca isn't a crop, catfish isn't a crop, coffee is what is grown in Puerto Rico as a crop. This one called dropstick, I always include that because I wonder if anybody in the audience knows what it is, because I don't know what it is, and people in the Department of Labor can't tell me what it is either. So I don't know. And then turtles, I mean, what is that? They're coming to work with turtles. So you can see these job titles are alligator farmhand, which I'm sure is in Florida, beekeeper, camp cook, citrus driver, cat crawfish worker. You know, that should be under H2B really, but anyway, and a pig monitor. I don't know what is a pig monitor? You know. Now the H2B certification data, they certify in all 50 states plus Puerto Rico and Washington D.C. So almost as many as H2A. There were 4,500 employers requested, and they requested over 108,000 workers. And then about 86,000 were certified. Now, if you combine those two figures, you can see that about 180,000 workers were certified under these visa programs. Now, the cap on the visa program supposedly is around 120, but obviously there's some push to increase that cap because more and more workers are certified. The important H2B states are Texas is the number one. They bring in about 12,000 workers, and most of them work in landscaping and construction. New York is the second largest. They employ about 4,000 workers. Most are in landscaping and animal care and stable attendants, but they're on the list are amusement park workers, which was part of the reason that this conference was called because of the abuse of the fair workers last year. And then Florida, most of them are brought in for the hospitality industry as chambermaids or waiters and wait staff, and also landscaping. These are some of the job titles that I found for all H2A workers, H2B workers. You can see there's some that you would think would be very easy to fill, but yet they're bringing in foreign workers. Car wash attendant, cartoonist. I mean, there's probably a lot of unemployed cartoonists out there. Ultrasound techs, those kind of guys, there's a lot of them. In New York, most of them come in for landscaping here, but stable attendants are another big group, and these guys care for racehorses primarily, and they actually live with the racehorses. It's a very crummy existence because the racehorses get misted with various kinds of chemicals to keep down pests and stuff, and so they often have problems with allergies and respiratory problems because of these mists that come down. Animal caretakers is probably also stable attendance. Wait staff is a big one here in New York. Some resorts hire H2B workers. And these are some other ones that I found on the New York list. Fishing deckhand. That one's actually bigger in Texas. There's a lot of shrimp deck workers shrimp vessel workers in Texas. Tattoo artist, teacher's aide, welder. Now, see, a nozzle and sleeve worker, I really don't know what that is. I imagine it's some sort of welder, because I know they bring in welders. And then amusement park worker is another one. So the thing about the big problem with from a labor rights perspective, the huge problem with managed migration programs in the United States and Canada anyway, is they are contracted to work for one employer. So it's very much like indentured servitude that, so you work for one employer. You do not have free access to the labor market. You can, the only alternative you have is to leave and go back to your home country. And often, you pay a big fee to get over here to a labor contractor or a recruiter. And so it's difficult to go back because you're going to be in debt. So there's an incentive for these people to stay and be very docile and do what their employer says. The contracted employers, the employers that employ guest workers, they have a lot of discretion over wages, working conditions, and housing conditions. And they can house people in very bad conditions if they want. There is very little state oversight because of budget constraints. The states often don't have people to go out and find out what's going on. So it usually doesn't come to the attention of the state unless there's a really egregious, criminal activity going on, similar to human trafficking. The conditions are highly variable. I've been around all throughout the eastern part of the United States and some in Texas, and I've seen a wide variety of conditions. Some of the examples of really good ones were, in fact, in upstate New York around Sodas. I saw this housing that was really nice, and the guys had, television and stuff, and they only worked an 8-hour day, and they were treated really nicely. And it was by this family that had about 8 workers that were guest workers, and they were able to treat them very nicely. In Virginia, I was just a couple of weeks ago in Virginia at a seafood plant where they only worked from, I think it was 6 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon, and they got a couple breaks, and they lived in really nice housing there as well. They were very happy with their circumstances. Contrary to the seafood processors in North Carolina that I've worked with, where they crowd them into an old school. There's 5 or 6 people in a single room. It often doesn't have air conditioning. They work them 16 to 20, sometimes 24 hours a day. It's incredible, how much the horror stories they tell there. Of course, the amusement park worker case was actually probably the worst case I've ever heard of, the one where they were only paid $1 an hour and, were malnourished and didn't have enough to drink and all kinds of stuff. And I've already mentioned stable attendance. Their conditions are pretty bad. Now I want to move on to the South Carolina case, and just to give you a kind of close-up of a specific case of a guest worker program. These are pictures from Sinaloa. They're all pictures of people who participate or families who participate in managed migration programs. Now, just to give you a little historical perspective, I've already mentioned that the guest worker programs have been growing, but particularly since NAFTA, they've been really more important in Mexico and also in Central America. And really, in the United States, there's been this move towards less humanitarian reasons for migration and more economic reasons for allowing immigrants into the United States. And that really changed with the 1986 Immigration Reform and Control Act. And we haven't really had a major immigration reform since then, and we're really ripe for one, because one usually comes around about every 20 years. Now, most of the guest worker programs used to be restricted to men, but because it was easy to separate, reproductive from productive labor. And historically, there were people who opposed women coming because they thought they would want to bring their children, or they were likely to get pregnant and settle and things like that. Now, there have been, though, over the past, since 1986, really, the growth of these gendered, female-dominated occupations who have been seeking guest workers. The two that I know best are seafood processing, which used to be done by African-American women, is now almost all done by Mexican women, and hotels, which is mostly Jamaican women who come in to work in South Carolina and other resort areas, also in New York and West Virginia and Virginia. Now, North Carolina, we import guest workers for all of our principal industries, rural industries, fisheries, agriculture, and forestry. Forestry, they plant, they either work in the Christmas trees or they plant pine trees for the big paper companies. Now, Sinaloa is in the northwest part of Mexico. It's across from Baja California. It's really an industrial agricultural landscape. It's dominated by industrial agriculture and food processing. There's a lot of big U.S. corn companies there that grow corn. There's a lot of genetically modified GMO crops grown there. It's highly industrialized. And that's where a lot of the people who get into this program work, and they can just barely survive working in the industrial agriculture or the fisheries there. They have these what I call colonias, which are nucleated settlements. They're scattered across the region, and it's between this area from Guasave, which is a big marketing center, and Los Mochis, another big marketing urban area. And between this area, there's at least 3 different kinds of communities. There's coastal fishing communities that are kind of also semi-working class because people can't survive only from fishing, and so they take jobs in the formal economy and become managed migrants. There are these nucleated settlements along the Pan American Highway that are predominantly rural working class communities. These people work mostly in the industrial agriculture and food processing. And then there's inland kind of peasant semi-working class communities. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of these different types of communities. They all supply guest workers to North Carolina. Cerro Cabezon is one. It's a coastal fishing village with a very small seafood processing operation that includes the processing of blue crabs. So it's where the women receive training to come to the United States. About 300 households, or 3,000 households are in this community, and they all have some sort of ties to fishing. The fisheries are small scale, what we call artisanal or peasant fisheries. They target crabs, sharks, snapper grouper, and other species from small vessels. The vessels actually are smaller in Puerto Rico, but here they're pretty small. And then a handful of women households send women to the mid-Atlantic seafood plants, and they also supply a lot of workers to Louisiana crayfish or crawfish processing. These are just some pictures of Cerro Cabezon. This is Seradia's family. She's one of the workers who comes to North Carolina, and then a couple of guys weaving nets, and just some other pictures of boats in the community. You can see it's a fishing village. The second kind is the kind of working class rural community along the Pan American Highway. It's essentially a service center for agriculture, food processing, and transportation. It's really densely populated. There isn't a lot of land for peasant agriculture or anything like that, and it sends over 100 families come to North Carolina to process seafood. North Carolina and Virginia. And then it has this AXA blue crab plant, and this is where many of the women receive training. In fact, they're required to become skilled at picking meat from blue crabs before they come to the United States. This is pictures of a lot of the one up in the corner there is that crab plant I just mentioned. And the others are pictures of women who have been working in these industries for quite some time. The woman down in the corner here used to be a contratista. She used to be a recruiter for the industry, but she's since gotten a little too old for that because it requires more work. And then the third type of community is San Sebastian. It's a ejido, or a community with communal lands west of Guasave. It's further inland from the Pan American Highway. They have a lot of peasant agriculture and also small brick making industry there. And a lot of people work in Guasave, which is a big urban area nearby. And then there are these other peasant communities all in a row, and they're all kind of people are related to one another. And again, they send these women to Virginia and North Carolina plants, and most of the women that come to come to the Mid-Atlantic are actually related to one another. They're sisters, aunts, cousins, things like that. Again, here's some pictures from this community. And the women that you see there, one's a mother and daughter. They have a store that they finance with working in the Mid-Atlantic crab industry. The other are mother and daughter. They also work in North Carolina. And then there's some bricks there, brick making. Now, when they join this labor force, they often get into this work because of some sort of family crisis. We collected these life histories, interviews of these women, and found that most of them had some sort of crisis involved. They had either experienced a divorce, there was a death of a spouse, their households were becoming very crowded, they were living with their parents, there were a couple of cases of domestic violence where they had to run away from their spouse. So it was often a crisis that stimulated them to get into this. Even though they come from different community backgrounds, when they join the labor force, they share similar experiences. And two of the main experiences are, first of all, they have to work in crab. They have to be trained first. And so the people in Gabriela Leyva and Cerro Cabazon have it pretty easy because there's crab plants right there. The people in San Sebastian actually have to drive for quite a ways to get that training, but they are trained before they come. That's a requirement. They also have to establish a network tie with a contratista. This is a labor recruiter, and it can be a formal or informal tie. In my case, in North Carolina, it's mostly an informal relation with a guy named Martin who does most of the recruiting for North Carolina plants. They used to have more plants in North Carolina and consequently more recruiters, but not anymore. The first thing that happens is, of course, they have to separate from their family. This is a very difficult decision for most of them, especially those with young or adolescent children. And most of the women who participate in this have children. In fact, all but one that we've interviewed have children, and they, and they, a lot of them are single mothers too, so they have to get somebody else to take care of their children when they're gone. It's often a family rather than an individual decision that they get together with their parents and their in-laws and other people and decide. Now, in some cases, it's been a liberating experience to leave, even if it's difficult. Getting away from a drunken husband was one case we came across. Leaving a very oppressive household where the woman was highly constrained in her movements, and feels much more freer in North Carolina, even though she's controlled in the plant and doesn't have transportation there. And then with the single mothers, they have to find these surrogate parents, and this is a really difficult decision for them to make, who to put in charge of their children. Sometimes it's elder children, sometimes it's mothers or aunts or people like that, but there are a lot of problems associated with this surrogate parenting. They lose authority over the children. They have to trust those that they put in charge. They send money back, of course. It's supposed to go to the children, but then the people who get it, they use it for other purposes. There was one case where the children were malnourished and had to go to the hospital because they weren't feeding the children, and this was like a cousin that was caring for them but was just using the remittances themselves. And then they say that in a lot of cases, the young women become pregnant and the young men turn to drugs because their parents aren't around. Now, once they're in North Carolina, though, they kind of reconstitute their family because they've left their family behind. And so they talk about the other crab workers as though they're members of the same family. And then over the couple of decades that this program's been going on, a lot of them have stayed in North Carolina. They've either married local men, and now there's a growing Mexican community in North Carolina, so it's much easier to do that in North Carolina now. Now, so these women, they can have three different options they can take. One is at the end of the work, what they're supposed to do is return home at the end of the work program. Most of them, the majority, actually do that. Now, some of them, though, they stay in North Carolina and continue working beyond their contracts until it's time to go back to get renewed to come back for the following year. So they'll stay maybe until April or March, and then they'll go back to Mexico and then come back into the program. Others will just remain in North Carolina permanently. They cut ties with Mexico. They don't really have that. They don't have young children there, and they're going to cut ties. So these are three cases. Marielba, she returned home because she wanted to expand her house, and she had a store to tend, and she had recently divorced her husband, so he could no longer tend the store. Diane, she stayed temporarily because her husband's dead, and she lives with her husband's brother and father in a very oppressive situation there in Mexico. So she stayed as long as she could, but then went back to get recertified and come back. And then there was a woman there named Nora who actually lives in my hometown who dropped out of the program in the mid-90s, and she actually became a very successful businesswoman in North Carolina, although she's really technically undocumented, but she has a really thriving business in my hometown. Now, when they return to if they take option one and return to their home community, they stay for about 4 months of the year there. A few go back into working in crab, but most kind of tend to their social relations there. If they stay temporarily in the U.S., they have to have some sort of connection. They have to have somebody that they can live with or that can help them, find a job or something like that. In one case, these women just went to a local hotel and said, we'll work as chambermaids, and they hired them and put them up in a room in the hotel while they were working there. So they could do that kind of thing too. Now, of course, technically this is illegal, but because they have that H2 visa, they can use it to get a driver's license and other identification, bank accounts, and things like that. So. Now, if they don't return, they really have to have a deeper kind of network tied other people for work and housing in the United States. And again, this is an option for women who don't have spouses or young children in Mexico or any other strong attachments to Sinaloa. Sometimes it involves getting married in North Carolina, and this can be to a Latino man who's living there or another a local North Carolinian. And then it does involve becoming undocumented after their visa expires, which is about, I think, 5 years or something. Or no, after their licenses expire that they've gotten with their visa. So just to conclude, this managed migration are kind of in line with the worldwide growth of what I call extreme forms of wage labor. And these are in line with flexible labor regimes that, in fact, one of the faculty members here in the geography department writes about, Jamie Winders, where they're separating productive and reproductive labor. Guest worker programs are able to achieve this legally, and so they're expanding really in step with flexible labor. These Sinaloa, just to summarize, the Sinaloa participants, they come from different backgrounds, but their experiences converge, and they behave in line with this kind of flexible labor regimes. But then they can go in these different directions, and they attempt to kind of reconstitute family. This is one of the points I make in my book, is that they try and treat these people like they're just workers, but of course they're human beings, and so they try and reconstitute family in their home settings or their different settings. And so they have these different alternatives of staying temporarily or not returning at all. Thank you.
Yeah. I kick you out.
I'll put this one. Oh, yeah.
Are we ready? No? Thank you, David. Thank you, Gretchen. It's really an honor to be here in Syracuse. I've been here a few times in the last few months, and really impressed with the work that's going on here with Rebecca and the Worker Center and all the support that's going out to the fair workers at the fair. And so I'm really humbled to be here with you all, and thank you for having me. Before I start, I just wanted to mention there will sort of be a slideshow, maybe if I remember to keep clicking the buttons while I'm talking. Basically, they're just photos. If you have any questions about the photos, you can ask me during the question and answer period. And please excuse my voice. I'm a little dry from interpreting David's talk. It was a little hard. I think I did okay. So as Gretchen mentioned, my name is Rachel Micah Jones, and I'm the founder and executive director of Centro de los Derechos del Migrante, or the Center for Migrant Rights. CDM is a transnational workers' rights organization based in Mexico, but works on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border to make positive changes for workers in the U.S. workplaces. I'm going to describe a little bit about CDM's cross-border work to support worker education and organizing along the migrant stream, our transnational legal strategies and policy advocacy, and also highlight opportunities I see to build on our work and our economy. So I'd like to start by telling you a little bit about me and why I founded CDM. After law school, as Gretchen also mentioned, I worked as a farm worker lawyer in Florida, representing some of Florida's 250,000 farm workers in employment matters, mostly wage claims. Quickly, I realized that most of my clients were from Mexico, about 90%, I would say. And wanting to understand where my clients were from and also wanting to practice my Spanish, I went down to Zacatecas, Mexico, where Martin is from, and to spend a few weeks there. Being completely obsessed with my job, I immediately began organizing Know Your Rights meetings for workers bound for the United States. I got to the very first meeting. It was a room actually bigger than this, and the room filled up pretty quickly. The workers, when I looked around the room, were workers who had been working in Florida. Some of them were workers who had been working in Florida for a really notorious contractor named Barajas. I had met these workers in their housing in Florida. I had visited them in their housing once a week. They had never said anything to me about how they were treated, although I knew horrible things were going on. I had heard rumors that this guy Barajas and some of the other Barajas contractors had killed people. These workers never said anything, but when I got to this meeting in Mexico, they stayed hours in that meeting, and they stayed to talk to me, and we ended up doing a number of intakes at the end of the meeting, and brought lawsuits against several related companies. For me, that experience is really powerful because it showed me that, really illustrated for me this fear factor that workers have, the fear of complaining about the conditions in their workplace housing. And in the home communities, a lot of these fear factors are minimized. Workers feel more comfortable talking about the issues in that situation, and when they're no longer working for the employer that really controls their legal status in the country. Over the next week, I had a series of other really powerful experiences. I met with the state director of migration, who actually recruited Martin for a job in Colorado. And when I talked to that director, I said, what happens? You guys are recruiting workers to go in these temporary programs to the United States. What happens when workers come back? And he said, you know what? Well, we do have problems. We have problems when workers come back and they're injured on the job, or workers who haven't been paid. And I said, well, what do you do with those workers? He said, oh, yeah, we send them to the U.S. consulate in Monterey. I was like, oh, really? Interesting. What do they do? Nothing. I was like, oh. I know why that is, but maybe we can try and reach out to the network of organizations in the U.S. who have limitations in supporting these workers, but who could possibly be mobilized to support them. And a few days later, this is just another example, I received a call from a colleague in the United States, another farm worker lawyer. She called me. She was really frantic. She said, "Rachel, I need your help. I have this case. It's in federal court. It's on behalf of the strawberry pickers. It's going to get dismissed because I can't get in touch with any of the witnesses." And I was like, "Okay, well, where are they from?" And she was like, "They're from Tacualeche." I was like, "Okay, well, what's the situation?" She said, "Well, the town phone, the caseta, isn't working, and so I can't talk to them." And I was like, "Okay, well, 4 kilometers away, I can go find them." So I went and I started knocking on doors in Tacualeche, found the witnesses, and they're like, "Oh yeah, of course we'll sign declarations. And you know what? We work there too, and we weren't treated right, and we want to do something about that." And I was like, "Okay, I'm not the lawyer, so let me give you my number. I'm here in Zacatecas for another few weeks. Call me." And there was just such excitement that I left that meeting really thinking that the worker advocacy community needs to have a presence in sending communities, really to meet workers in this safer space, but also to provide support when workers go home. So I started going and talking, reaching out to groups in Mexico. A lot of the groups in Mexico were saying, they were really focused on migrants who were coming to Mexico from Central America or who were in transit, and at that point weren't ready to provide this project, to support this kind of project. And groups in the United States were typically not interested, although there were farm worker groups who were interested, but they really wanted to focus exclusively on farm workers. And for me, that division was really arbitrary, because what I had seen just for the short period of time that I was working with farm workers was that a lot of the farm workers were farm workers one day and landscapers or construction workers the next, and that these were the very same workers, and not only were they the very same workers, but that distinction between ag and non-ag really didn't seem valid, because the sort of the employment relationships, the structure of relationships with contractors and was same in ag and other low-wage industries, or at least started becoming more so like that in Florida. So I moved to start CDM, and it's right now a nonprofit in the U.S. and in Mexico, and basically, that's just the founding story, and I tell it because I think it does illustrate why we're using the strategies that we're using and how we have this sort of global labor system that national advocacy and national justice systems don't recognize. At CDM, we're engaged in a multi-pronged strategy to improve the working conditions of migrants and their co-workers in low-wage, high-risk industries in the U.S. Oh, perdón. All right, forget my show. Sorry. There we go. It's a little, hold on a minute. I'll fix it later. We'll see it at the end. We partner with migrant workers, both undocumented workers, but mostly guest workers. And as David told us, we have guest workers who are working in H2A, which means typically agricultural jobs, and also H2B, non-agricultural jobs in the United States. We conduct extensive pre-departure education efforts with workers, and we support the leadership development of peer-to-peer educators and leaders like Martin, who make up the Comité or the Migrant Defense Committee. Martin is a leader of the regional comité in Zacatecas, Mexico. So what we do is we provide workers like Martin information and tools in their communities, and often having this information and these connections to CDM, but also other workers, helps workers prevent abuse. And when workers suffer abuse, they can work collectively with their peers to address these issues. If workers are retaliated against, which is too often the case, our binational staff, which includes U.S. attorneys, provides legal support. One example, which I'd like to highlight because we're in New York and because it's the fair, is the case that I believe Martin is going to describe in greater detail of Dreamland Amusements. One of Martin's co-workers and also another leader of the Comité, Jose Isabel de Lira, was recruited to work for Dreamland in Zacatecas. And they were recruited, they were told that they were going to work in another industry, they were going to work in construction, but Martin's going to tell you these details. But basically what happened is Jose and his coworkers got to the United States and they realized something wasn't right. They had their passports confiscated, they weren't being paid what they were promised, it was a totally different industry, the conditions were terrible. So Jose started talking to his coworkers on the job, and they started sort of, a little bit of organizing. Jose approached the boss, was not successful. So he called us, and we were, we're in Mexico. We were in Mexico at the time. At that time, we didn't have a U.S. presence, and we called an organization in New York called the Workers' Rights Law Center of New York. Workers' Rights Law Center of New York sent a group out to the fair, tried to find the workers, did not find Jose, but did find some of the other workers, and in turn got the New York Attorney General's office involved. The New York Attorney General's office did an investigation, pushed the case, was able to settle the case for $325,000 for the workers, and it was a success. But for me, what was more of a success with that case was that when Jose and his coworkers went back to Mexico, they said, you know what? This didn't only happen to us, but there were lots of other workers who recruited along with us to work for other companies in the United States. And so we're going to reach out to those workers, and we're going to share our experiences about the Dreamland case with them. And so Jose and his coworkers helped convene meetings with fair workers at CDM's offices in Zacatecas. We ended up bringing 3 lawsuits against other fair companies, one in Georgia, one in North Carolina, and one in California. The one in California and the one in Georgia settled. The one in North Carolina, we had a terrible decision because the workers were pretty sure they had worked in North Carolina. It turns out it was actually Virginia. And, it's funny, but it's really horrible because now they can't do anything about their case. So we lost the case. They were pretty sure they were in Carolina del Norte. The employers told them they were in Carolina del Norte. The fair schedule online said Carolina del Norte. We thought we had confirmed it, but anyway, alas, it wasn't true. But I think it also shows that a lot of times workers are really isolated, and in this case didn't know what state they were working in. So after sort of the work in Zacatecas with the local workers, a lot of those workers came together and said, you know what, we're just a small group of the workers who are recruited to work in the fair industry in the United States. There's a couple hundred of us, but there are thousands of workers recruited from this one town in Veracruz to work in the fair industry. And many of those workers are working for companies like Dreamland, Straight Shows, and other companies here in New York. And so the comité sent a delegation to Tlapacoyan, Veracruz, to meet with fair workers there. So another comité leader, el otro Martín, el Lobo, as we call him, or the wolf, I guess, led a delegation of workers down to Veracruz to meet workers there, and those workers have joined the campaign. 2 of the workers became leaders, were just recently brought in as leaders of the comité, and negotiations began with the major recruiter for the industry in Zacatecas. So it's this kind of work, through our work in home communities with the comité, through our casework, and just working along with comité members, we've identified several obstacles for justice for migrant workers in the United States. Those obstacles include the structural flaws with the guest worker program, some of which David had talked about. But we've really realized that guest worker recruitment is an industry that's becoming more and more important right now, and there's increasing interest in guest worker programs as a way to support low-wage labor markets and deal with unauthorized migration. And we've realized that there really aren't many avenues to address recruitment abuses. CDM is working on opening up those avenues through education, documentation, analysis, reporting, and rallying our allies to join together to come up with a unified plan. As a result of our education efforts, we're being approached by H2B workers a lot from all different industries, sometimes before they go, but certainly once they return home. These H2B workers have very few options in the U.S. for seeking support from unions or lawyers. They're frequently recruited to poorly regulated sectors, as David mentioned a bunch of these sectors. And they don't fall under the radar of labor enforcement organizations, also like David mentioned, and really find it difficult to connect with organizing efforts and their work communities in the United States. And it's not just because their status is temporary, but also because they don't often return to the same employer or the same industry even year after year. And often this is intentional on the part of the recruiters or the employers. So CDM is looking for ways to ensure that these workers access their rights and can hold corporations accountable, that they're not treated as exceptions under federal or state minimum wage and overtime laws, like the traveling carnival workers who are excluded from basic minimum wage protections, or crab workers in Maryland who are exempt from Maryland's minimum wage protections, and that they're not legally prohibited from accessing legal services. The federal regulations prevent H2B workers from accessing legal services attorneys, which is pretty outrageous. One way to address some of these issues is through reform of our labor migration laws. One is through H2B and other regulatory reform. One way is through litigating cases to hold employers accountable for violating minimum standards, abusing the guest worker visa program, and attempting to skirt basic labor and health and safety laws. And examples of litigation include the traveling fare companies who claim they're exempt from minimum wage requirements, the hot pen construction industry that imports guest workers as agricultural workers in an effort to avoid paying overtime. And we are supporting the efforts of other cases against employers in the peach, landscaping, and other industries. Advocates for corporations are preparing to advocate for expansion of the current flawed program as is. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce released a report advocating for the current H2B program, and Senator Mikulski from Maryland is pressuring the Department of Labor not to issue new regulations. And I should tell you that these new regulations were ordered by the court in a case that we brought in the federal district in Pennsylvania. And we have senators who are pressuring the Department of Labor, even after getting a court order, from not issuing these new regulations. So for me, an important component of our work must include the policy advocacy, must include continuing to pressure our officials, but it really means bringing worker voices and a transnational perspective to these policy debates around labor and migration policies. These policies necessarily have impacts in communities across national boundaries and have serious impacts on the lives of workers and their families. Since its founding 5 years ago, thousands of workers from 23 Mexican states have participated in CDM's trainings, and we estimate thousands more have been reached by comité leaders themselves. We've recovered over $5 million in unpaid wages and other compensation, and together with allies have been successful in advocating for changes in administrative policies and processes that make justice easier to access for migrant workers. And other groups are using exciting and innovative binational strategies as well. In the Philippines, there is a group working with migrants before they leave for Saudi Arabia, and they're monitoring migrants using an SMS, SOS, emergency text messaging system. It's pretty cool. And we're really inspired by this work. We're proud of our work, encouraged by the important work of our allies. But the results are really tiny, considering the current state of affairs. There are, as David mentioned, over 100,000 guest workers, and most discussions with folks in Washington and with people who are working on this issue is there's the expectation that these programs will grow and expand drastically, and most of the discussions on the Hill right now about immigration reform include a pretty expansive guest worker program, which is basically based on the same structure of our current guest worker program. And as a recent NELP report highlighted, workers in low-wage industries generally are being robbed of millions and millions of dollars each week. So as human beings, as human rights and workers' rights advocates and concerned citizens here, we need to recognize that our labor policies require that we work across borders and support worker-centered approaches. I hope you'll take the good time to hear out Martin and Martin's proposals and hear more about his experiences, and to continue supporting the work of the Worker Center here in Syracuse and efforts to bring justice to migrant workers on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. And now for the presentation. Let's see if I can start the slideshow. I'll do it real quick. Perdón, ¿cómo lo vaya? Yeah, sorry, I don't know why I get so there. How do I do this?
I'll do it. Don't worry. Ven aquí.
And also, you're going to have to excuse my interpretation. Yo.
Ok. ¿Qué tal? Buenas tardes.
Hello. Buenas tardes. Good afternoon.
Mi nombre es Martín Dávila.
My name is Martín Dávila.
Soy originario del estado de Zacatecas, México.
I'm originally from the state of Zacatecas, Mexico.
Zacatecas es un estado que está al centro norte del país.
Zacatecas is a state in the center north of the country.
Y he estado trabajando aquí en Estados Unidos por un periodo de cuatro años, no consecutivos.
And I've been working in the United.
Bueno, he estado trabajando 4 años aquí en Estados Unidos como trabajador huésped.
I've been working in the United States for 4 years as a guest worker.
Los primeros 3 años los trabajé en el estado de Colorado.
The first 3 years I worked in the state of Colorado.
En la ciudad de Thornton, es una ciudad que está un poquito al norte de Denver.
In the city of Thornton, in a city that's a little bit to the north of Denver.
Allí estuve trabajando como cortando zacate para la ciudad.
There I was working cutting grass for the city.
En el tercer año se nos empezó a cobrar dinero por cosas que no tiene así mucha importancia de mencionarlo, pero que sí era muy importante porque si no dábamos dinero no podíamos trabajar.
Okay. So in the third year, they started charging us money for things that aren't necessarily important, but it was important because if we didn't give money, we couldn't work. No, I need to take note. Más despacio.
Okay. El caso fue que las autoridades del Civic Center.
The case was that the authorities of the city
se dieron cuenta y el programa se terminó.
The authorities of the city found out and the program was finished.
Mediante una investigación judicial que se hizo.
By way of a judicial investigation that happened.
Yo me he preguntado,
I've asked myself,
¿por qué me voy a Estados Unidos a trabajar?
Why do I go to the United States to work?
Zacatecas literalmente es un estado más pobre que Sinaloa. Sinaloa tiene mucha industria pesquera y otro tipo de industrias.
Zacatecas literally is a poorer state than Sinaloa. Sinaloa has some industry like fishing industry.
Zacatecas tiene su mayor productividad en el sector construcción.
Zacatecas has its major productivity in the construction sector.
Pero el trabajo es muy mal pagado.
But the work is very low paid, badly paid, poorly paid.
Tan es así que su gente decide emigrar a otros estados de México.
It's like this, so it's people decide to migrate to other places in Mexico.
Pero la mayor parte de su gente emigra hacia los Estados Unidos.
But the majority of its people migrate to the United States.
En la actualidad, Zacatecas tiene un promedio de 50% de zacatecanos como emigrantes.
In actuality, Zacatecas has an average of 50% of its people in the United States.
Es por eso por lo que yo decidí también en una ocasión que hubo oportunidad de emigrar a Estados Unidos.
It's for this reason that I decided when there was opportunity to migrate to the United States.
En el año 2002.
In the year 2002.
En el año 2002 comencé a trabajar en Thornton, 2003 y 2005.
In 2002, I went to work for the city of Thornton in 2003 and also 2005.
En el 2007 se me reclutó en Zacatecas.
In 2007, they recruited me in Zacatecas.
Por medio de una institución de gobierno.
By the means of a government agency in Zacatecas.
Para venir a trabajar a Estados Unidos.
To come and work in the United States.
En la ciudad de Zacatecas.
In the city of Zacatecas.
Se nos invitó a trabajar para venir a trabajar a la construcción
They invited us to come work here in construction
y a cortar zacate.
and to cut grass.
Eso ¿cómo les diré?
Convenció.
Eso nos convenció a aceptar y emigrar.
This convinced us to accept the jobs and migrate
Porque nos ofrecieron económicamente buenas propuestas.
because they offered us, economically speaking, good proposals. Good proposal.
Nos trasladamos a la ciudad de Monterrey a tramitar nuestros documentos como es la visa.
We traveled to Monterrey to process our visa.
Para eso tuvimos que conseguir dinero prestado.
For this, we needed to take out money in loans.
Pero en la ciudad de Monterrey, ahí se nos informó que nuestro trabajo iba a ser para trabajar en una feria.
But in the city of Monterrey, they informed us that our work was really to be in a fair company.
Se nos informó que nos iban a pagar a $5 la hora.
And that they were going to pay us $5 an hour.
Nosotros tuvimos que aceptar porque ya habíamos dejado deudas en nuestra tierra.
We had to accept because we had already left debts in our land.
Y pues teníamos que pagar.
We had to pay them.
Ya cuando nos trasladamos a la ciudad de Dover, Delaware.
Later, when we traveled to the city of Dover, Delaware,
tuvimos una entrevista con el manager de la compañía.
We had an interview with the manager of the company.
Y ahí nos dijo él que nos iba a pagar $275 por semana.
And there he told us he was going to pay us $275 a week.
Que si no queríamos aceptarlo, que nos podíamos retirar.
And if we didn't want to accept it, then we could leave.
Igual que en Monterrey no nos quedó otra alternativa.
Exactly like Monterrey, we didn't have another alternative.
Y comenzamos a trabajar.
We began to work.
Nuestro trabajo consistía
Our work consisted of
en atender a la gente como al público.
in attending to the public.
Ese trabajo era entre 10 y 12 horas diario.
Between 10 and 12 hours. This work of attending to the public.
Ese trabajo era el ordinario, el básico.
This was the ordinary work, the basic work.
Uh-huh. Pero cuando se trataba de armar y desarmar los juegos,
But when we had to put together and take apart the rides,
ahí teníamos un periodo de trabajo entre 20, 22 y hasta 24 horas.
there we had a period of work between 20, 22, and sometimes even 24 hours.
Se nos daba muy poco oportunidad de salir a comer inclusive.
They gave us very little opportunity to leave to eat,
Mucho menos de descansar.
and much less to rest.
Las condiciones de trabajo eran muy riesgosas,
The conditions of work were very risky,
ya
very
que
dangerous,
no contábamos
that we didn't that we didn't have,
no contábamos con protección alguna.
that we didn't have any protections.
No contábamos con casco,
We didn't have any helmets,
con guantes,
we didn't have gloves,
gongles, dientes,
like this, glasses, goggles, safety goggles,
zapatos de casquillo,
security shoes or hard shoes,
cintos de seguridad, no contábamos
safety
con nada.
belts. We didn't have any of
Y
that.
teníamos que estar trabajando en alturas extremosas hasta de 10, 12 metros.
And we were working at very high heights, up to 10 to 12 meters.
Igual que no importaba si estaba haciendo calor,
And it didn't matter if it was hot,
frío
cold,
o lluvia.
raining. I mean,
Las condiciones a veces no se soportaban.
the conditions couldn't be supported.
Es muy importante también para mí mencionarles
It's very important for me to mention
las condiciones en las que nos tenían viviendo
the conditions in which
lo
they had
que
us living
los pocos ratos que descansábamos.
and the few times we could rest.
Eran en unas trailers
They were in some trailers.
para una persona, ahí nos metían hasta 2 o 3 o 4 gentes.
For a place that would be normally for one person, there would be 3 or 4 people.
No teníamos dónde hacer nuestras necesidades fisiológicas.
We didn't have any place to take care of our physiological
No
needs.
teníamos un lugar estable para dónde comer.
We didn't have a stable place to eat.
No teníamos un lugar estable donde asearnos,
We didn't asearnos.
bañarnos.
We didn't have a stable place to bathe. We didn't have a place to bathe.
Era una condición muy reprobable para mí.
It was a very reproachable situation for me.
Yo creo que en el laboralmente hablando es una cosa que yo no quisiera decirles, pero lo tengo que hacer.
Speaking of this work is a situation that I don't want to tell you, but I feel I have to.
Nuestra forma de que nos pagaban era
The form in which they paid us was
en efectivo.
was in cash.
No se nos dio la oportunidad de firmar un contrato como empleador y empleado.
They didn't give us any opportunity to sign a contract between worker and employer.
No tuvimos un registro en nuestro seguro para
We didn't get
recuperar
any
taxas.
register with Social Security for tax purposes.
No hubo un control así de horarios para trabajar.
There was no control of the schedule, no registration of the schedule.
Y les voy a mencionar por qué.
And I'm going to tell you why.
Porque dentro del trabajo también
Because also within the work
era parte el traslado de una ciudad a otra.
Was the transportation between one work site to another.
Había veces que teníamos que
There were times when we had to
¿cómo se dice? Viajar.
You had to travel.
Teníamos que viajar de una ciudad a otra 2, 3, 4 y hasta 6 horas.
You had to travel 2, 3, 4, and sometimes 6 hours.
Y ahora sí que nos pasaba, como mencionaba la compañera Raquel, que no sabíamos en qué parte estábamos.
And here what happened to us is what the compañera Rachel said, that we didn't know in what state we were in or where we were.
Llegábamos a una ciudad
We would get to a city
y no había dónde descansar del viaje.
and there was no place for us to rest from the trip.
No había dónde comer
There wasn't a place for us to eat.
y no teníamos un lugar para, digamos, para bañarnos otra
We
vez.
didn't have any place to bathe.
A grandes rasgos, esa es mi experiencia que me pasó a mí en la compañía Driftman.
In the grand scheme, this is the experience that happened to me when I worked for the Dreamland Company.
Y como decía la compañera Raquel, el Centro de Derechos del Migrante nos apoyó.
And like the compañera Raquel said, the
Se nos
Center for
hizo
Migrants
una indemnización.
helped us. There was
A base de mucho trabajo estuvimos trasladándonos a varias partes de México.
there was an indemnization, and we traveled to various parts of Mexico,
Buscando personas que estuvieron trabajando en las ferias.
to for the people, the various people that were working in the fairs.
Y pues logramos, ahora sí que por medio del Centro de Derechos del Migrante, logramos ganar el caso.
And we achieved winning the case.
El Centro de Derechos del Migrante, yo soy miembro del Comité de Derechos del Migrante en Zacatecas.
I'm a member of the Migrant Defense Committee in Zacatecas.
Y el Comité del Centro de Derechos para mí representa una organización no lucrativa.
And for me, the committee represents an organization without, with nonprofit.
Donde se le apoya a los migrantes
That,
activos aquí en Estados Unidos.
that supports migrants who are active here in the United States.
O migrantes que ya regresaron a México.
Or migrants who have already returned to Mexico.
Que alguna vez recibieron un maltrato, recibieron un fraude, fueron víctimas de fraude.
That at one time received some mistreatment or were victims of fraud.
O que no se les pagó lo que la ley otorga.
Or they weren't paid what the law establishes.
O que tuvieron que regresar a sus casas porque sufrieron un accidente y no se les indemnizó lo que la ley les otorga.
Or who had to return to their homes because they had an accident on the job and didn't get the compensation that the law requires.
En particular en Zacatecas tenemos un compañero líder.
In Zacatecas in particular, we have a compañero líder,
que perdió su vista aquí en Estados Unidos trabajando.
Who lost his vision here in the United States working.
Él se llama Manuel.
His name is Manuel.
Y el Centro de Derechos de Migrante le apoyó para que se le indemnizara con el patrón.
And CDM, Center for Migrant Rights, helped him so that they got indemnification from the boss.
En la actualidad él está recibiendo una pensión económica.
And in reality, he's receiving an economic pension.
Que la ley le autorizó.
That the law authorizes for him. Mm-hmm.
Y yo lo que busco en el Comité de Defensa del Migrante.
What I look for in the Migrant Defense Committee.
Es promoverlo y hacerle saber a todos los compañeros migrantes.
Is to promote it and to let all of the migrant compañeros know about it.
De que hay muchas organizaciones aquí en Estados Unidos y en otras partes del mundo y en especial en México.
That there are lots of organizations, especially in the United States and also in other parts of the world.
Que hay gentes que nos están apoyando.
That there are people who are supporting us.
En nuestras necesidades, tanto laborales.
In our necessities, like from work.
Que nos pueden asesorar en cuestiones legales.
And can provide legal advice.
Que nos pueden asesorar en cuestiones migratorias.
And then they could advise us in migration issues.
Y que nos pueden ayudar a salir de algún problema en general.
And can help us get out of problems in general.
Eso es mi conclusión. Gracias.
This is my conclusion. Thank you. Sure. I'll get a new one. Here's some more pictures, just in case, for those who are... I'll do them quick. There's Martin somewhere in here. There he is at the People's Global Action. I'm doing him quick. Yeah, well, Rebecca's over there reminded me that I did leave some materials about CDM on that table. I didn't have a ton of them, so if there are folks who do want to get materials who didn't, if you want to pass me your name and your email or your address, I'd be happy to make sure you receive them.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Rebecca Fuentes, and I am with the Worker Center of Central New York here in Syracuse. This is an organization that is relatively new, but it came about through the preoccupation from a lot of activists and advocates for workers' rights and human rights to put together an organization such as a Worker Center so that workers like Martin and others could have support in their struggle. Worker centers in the national scheme are every day coming up more and more because, as we know, a lot of places now, or a lot of workplaces that used to have places like a union, which will support workers and give them and have things like collective bargaining and all of that, are kind of out of the map, right, disappearing. And so worker centers is like an answer to that, and it's mostly for workers who are low-wage workers, and in that category, vulnerable workers like migrant workers, guest workers, but in general, I mean, anyone that is in the service industry. And so I want to just, because I only have 10 minutes, I guess I have to be very, very fast. But what I want to tell you is about how did we find out about this issue, this extreme case of abuse and exploitation at the New York State Fair. It was about last year around this time, Labor Day weekend, when I received a phone call from a friend who had met two young men at a local upstate medical university emergency room. Just by talking to them, I mean, they told her, that they were from Mexico. They were there. I mean, they told her why they were there. And they mentioned, that they showed her a contract from Mexico, and that they had, they had a contract with this company that had hired them in Mexico, that they were promised, a good hourly rate, like $10.71, and all of the things that you will expect for any worker here, paid overtime, have some day for rest, and in addition, housing was provided, and they were going to be deducted $25 a week for the housing. So these two young men, one of them was there because he had become very sick, because he was working many hours, and he was very dehydrated, and also very malnourished because he wasn't getting paid. He couldn't eat well, even though he was working in a food service provider, and they were working for a vendor. His name is Peter Karageorgis, and the name of his business is Peter's Fine Greek Foods. And this vendor goes, his business is to go at different fairs and carnivals and sell gyros and other things and salads and so they were working for this vendor, but they weren't they will be able to eat at least, maybe if they were lucky, like one meal a day, and not even eat it comfortably. They have to be in a hurry, and then they will work like 16 to 18 hours a day. So they were extremely tired and malnourished. And one of them, Antonio, the reason why he was at the hospital, he told us, was because he had this infection on his body. He had a rash, and it came about, he says, because he was working so many hours in front of a grill, and also he had been living in a trailer that was infested with bed bugs. So he will get bitten, he will scratch, and then he worked sweating all day. So all of that, created an infection. He had been going to the infirmary twice at the fair, because they have a couple of infirmaries at the fair. And the second time, they said, you need some blood tests done, so we're going to send you to the hospital. And with him went another worker who was also sick because he hurt his back. Samuel is the name of the young worker that we met. And Samuel told us that he believes the reason why he was allowed to not work, because they didn't really care if they had issues with their health, was because he was scratching so much, and it was this was a food, concession. So people will be thinking like, this guy is scratching, so it looked bad. So that's why they sent him to the trailer. It wasn't much concern for his health. This is Samuel over here. This is a picture that I took when we were at the fair. This is the first day that we met him, and when we went to let me go back. We went and met, and my friend is here, Pat Rector. We both went and met these two workers, and our initial idea was, okay, we have some issues here. We didn't know much of detail, so we thought this is an issue of wage theft, it looks like. We're going to find out what it is and see how we can help them. So when we start talking to them, and we're thinking we're just going to give them a ride back to their job place, and then they started telling us all about all these things, and then they show us this contract, and then they tell us about their conditions. We thought, well, this is more than just a wage theft thing. This is, in fact, this is just, right now, let's take care of like the most basic things, like they are hungry, they have to eat. So we decided to take them to eat, and also they had some prescriptions that were given. Of course, they didn't have any money, so we went to a pharmacy. It was hard to find one open because it was Labor Day weekend, and it was kind of late, but we did that. And when we went and take them out to eat, it was they started to talk more about their situation and how they've been from Durango, and how they've been recruited over there to get this good job. $10.71 an hour. That's basically what they could make if they're lucky, like in one day in Mexico. So it was like a very good deal. And also, just to relate it to what they were saying about workers, I mean, for example, Samuel, he had to leave his wife and his young son with his parents. So just to make this sacrifice to come over here, there was not a lot of jobs. There was so this was a great opportunity to come and work. So we met these two workers, but they were part of 19 workers that were with this vendor. And they started to telling us, all these awful things that happened to them. And we started to document everything and see, and immediately knew that they were owed money. I mean, the basic thing, they were owed money, definitely. But on top of that, when they continued to talk to us, we're finding out that, there's so many issues of health and safety. Like Martin was saying, they weren't providing adequate housing. They weren't being fed. And maybe the vendor, it wasn't his obligation to feed them, but in the contract it says at least one meal. And then we will say, of course, why weren't they eating? Well, because they weren't getting paid. So all of those things. So there were so many issues there. And so at this point, we find out there are H2B visa workers. And then we start doing some research and finding out that it's not so easy just to leave your employer. Because like they said, you are just bound to this one employer who brought you here. So, and in fact, that had been one of the things that the employer had been using to keep them captive. If you say something, we're going to take away your visa. And in fact, he took several times their passport with their visa, and then he will return it. But it was like this game, just to make them fearful. Or you are not, if you say, if you start complaining, you're never going to come back. But I'm going to make sure that you are blacklisted and you won't get here, won't be able to be back. And in fact, he had done to somebody else earlier, like a month earlier, we found out through some of the workers that he had fired another worker who wanted to get paid what he was owed. And this vendor basically just left them on the street with no money, and this poor guy, his name is Rafael from Veracruz, he had to just beg on the streets. It was in Orange County. Beg on the streets so that he could go to New York City to find help at the Mexican consulate. Unfortunately, the Mexican consulate wasn't that helpful. I mean, they just told him, in 1 week, right now there's no lawyer, but in 1 week, if you wait, you can get access to some legal advice, but you might not recover your money. I mean, it might take too long. Well, Rafael didn't have any place to stay, so he just begged for more money and was able to get enough to get himself on a bus and just make it to Veracruz. Thanks to some of the workers, we were able to contact him, and he's part of the Federal Department of Labor complaint, and he will get hopefully some money because that federal complaint is still it has been appealed by the vendor, and in September the Federal Department of Labor is going to court. But we're very, very happy that we were able to contact him, because that was such an injustice that happened to him, to all of them. But when we told him, you might be able to get a visa to come back and do something about this, or just a visa because you were a victim of a crime, he said, no, never. he was done, with that experience that he had in this country. But going back to Antonio and Samuel, even though there were 19 workers, not all of them were on the same page about doing something. And even before we got into the picture, they had been talking about doing something. They had been organizing themselves. So some of them were like, we want to speak up and we want to do something about it, but we still want to work. So that was the thing that kind of kept them, like I said, captive. We want to work, but we want to do something. So they didn't really know what were their rights. So, yeah, good. So we were through, they allow us to, because we weren't going to do anything that they didn't want to do. But the ones that wanted to participate in an investigation and the ones who were wanting to talk, which were about 10 of them, they asked us to contact the authorities, whoever. And, they just wanted to make sure that it was going to be, like, some of them were like, we just don't want to give our name and everything. So it wasn't easy to get anybody because it was the Labor Day weekend. But we have a good relationship with the Federal Department of Labor locally, and we were able to contact the regional director. And she sent an investigator on a Sunday, which, I mean, we know government agencies don't work on Sundays, but she was there, and this is one day before Labor Day. The place is packed, and the vendor wasn't expecting an investigation. He had been telling their workers, if an investigator comes over here, you are going to tell them you make this much, and that and everything is fine. If you say something else, that something is going to happen to you. So, but like I said, some of these workers were fed up and they were ready to speak up, and so some of them did, and so that's how the federal investigation with the DOL got started. Eventually, there was also a criminal investigation started by the Department of Justice, and that was when this was about the day before the fair ended, and so they were transported to another place in New York, and was it? Queens, New York, yes. And so over there, they continue to be interrogated, and the investigation continues. And even though they were over there, we were still over here supporting them. And now that I see my friend Marie, she was making phone calls with them, trying to rescue them from this parking lot that had been, that's where they were being kept, and on the trailers, and it was locked, and they were locked in, and there was a lot of situations, but thanks to their willingness and their courage and their, the desire to get justice, and also that in the process that we learned so much, that we learned that that it wasn't so obvious what were the things that we were going to do, because we at the time we didn't know this was a case of human trafficking. We knew something was very wrong, but once we started putting everything together and their testimony and what they were saying, then we figured out this is definitely a case of human trafficking. And when they were in New York, close to New York City, that's when the criminal investigation started. And just to make that short, the criminal investigation, they were working here in September. They didn't see their money, some of them, until December. They were certified as victims of human trafficking, some of them, the ones who decided to participate in the investigation, but that meant that they couldn't work. So they came here to work, and now they're victims of human trafficking with the possibility of getting a visa in the future, because that was, if they're victim of human trafficking, they could get a visa, but then they're not working, and they want to send money to their families, and they're telling them, the authorities are telling them, wait a little bit more. So when they got their money, most of them went back to Mexico. And but that was one group in that criminal investigation who had their money. Now the federal ruling from the DOL, that's the one that's being appealed, and that will give the money to about another 9 workers. But it's unfortunate that many of them had to return because that took away the possibility for some of them to get the visa. It made it more difficult. But we're still working with some of them, with 3 of them, which 4 of them who still we're finding out that they still have that possibility of getting this visa, because a lot of them get blacklisted. That's an issue, a very strong issue, a difficult issue that they get confronted with when they go back to Mexico. If they assert their rights here, they're going to go back there, and they're not going to find a job, because then the net of recruiters is very small, and they know each other, and so that's what we're finding out. But now, just very briefly, what we've been doing ever since then, is like I said, we have been learning as a group of advocates and activists, what is that we can do. We have written letters with other organizations to the governor that prompted them to do a lot of work this year at the fair, and that's happening. Like the first 2 days of the fair, there was an outreach that was in collaboration with the Department of Labor, the State Department of Labor, and also the Worker Center and other community activists from other groups. And we distribute information about workers' rights those 2 days. And the New York State Department of Labor assured us that they're going to be there. They're still there. That was not the only thing they were going to do. They will also continue to do investigations and just be present at the fair. One thing that that we were also able to accomplish, and this was at the request of the workers. They said, well, what is this? Is this man going to be able to come back again to the fair? Are they going to continue, let him sell again? And so what we ask people to do is to leave messages. First, we wanted to do a petition, but then somebody else came with this idea, let's tell people to go to their Facebook page of the fair and just leave message after message after message. That's very public, and the New York State Fair has been using that Facebook for a lot of promoting. They're bringing Justin Bieber and Maroon 5, and so we're putting our messages there. Don't let this vendor come back, because he did these horrible things and these abuses to workers. And we also encourage people to send emails to the New York State Fair. And another thing that we are asking people to do is to sign a petition, because a petition opposing a law that is being this Assemblyman Bill McGee, is his name, from Nolan, a Democrat, he put out there, he's sponsoring this law that basically will take away overtime rights for fair and carnival workers. And we think, and I personally believe, that it's just making this very common practice in this industry, just making it legal. At least in New York, because in other places, in other states, that's legal. In fact, under the Federal Labor Standards Act, temporary workers such as fair and carnival workers are not covered by the overtime pay. So, but states have the power to overrule that. But here in New York, I mean, we are lucky that unlike the farm workers, which still don't get paid overtime, the temporary workers such as fair and carnival, they're still covered for overtime. But these assemblymen, and also lobbyists for this industry of the fair and carnival, they are very powerful. They're trying to take away overtime pay for workers. And so what we're asking today is, just because we want to leave you with some action, something to do, is to sign this petition opposing this. We don't think it's going to go that far, but still, we want to send a message that, we care about all workers. So we're asking you for that. Also, if you want to sign to be part of to receive information about the Worker Center and other actions that we're doing. Right now, we're supporting some workers who are working for temporary agencies, and there's a lot of abuse and exploitation in that industry too. So if you want to receive information, you can sign up over there. We have also other information about the Worker Center, and thank you.
We have 13 minutes for questions.
Well, I have a question for Rachel. Do you see greater opportunities for participation by the private bar? I mean, and what would that be? I mean, given some of the stuff you've mentioned, the jurisdictional issues, and would it take specific legislation about causes of action and fee provisions, or maybe that's happened? I don't know.
Yeah, no, I do think that there are opportunities for the private bar to get involved and to take these cases. And I do think a lot of private attorneys haven't taken the cases because they're concerned about having clients who are back in Mexico. But one of the things that we do is try and help make that easier and try and encourage private attorneys to take those cases, because we can do depositions in Mexico, or get workers to sites and have interrogatories signed, for example. So we can provide sort of litigation support on that side. Some of these cases are big cases, involving lots of workers, but more often than not, they're small groups of workers, and particularly in the fair industry, the employers don't have tons of assets. They have some assets, but we're not finding, really huge companies that private attorneys are willing to go after. But yeah, I definitely think that there are opportunities for the private bar to get involved, certainly supporting at least the workers' comp, the workplace injury cases, and the wage cases, and particularly sort of like on a small scale, but if they're willing to take cases on a small scale basis. And there are also tons of issues, our organization really focuses on, workplace justice issues, so wages and health and safety. But we do get a ton of inquiries about family law issues and tons of other legal issues, tax issues, for which we don't have a really strong network of transnational advocates willing to bring those cases. And so we've been trying to develop resources, basic kits about how to handle tax issues for H2 workers, for example, or family law issues, custody issues, that kind of thing. But that's not our focus, and it'd be really great to get private attorneys involved to create resources that we can't provide, because it's not our specialty. We don't really have the expertise to do that. So that would be a great way, just developing materials or like do-it-yourself kits, I guess, to be able to handle some of those issues. Definitely just taking the individual cases if folks could. Are you a private lawyer? Just
Retired.
Retired. Would you be interested? Another list out there. No, that's actually, it's a real struggle for us to find lawyers to take these cases. It is a real struggle. And, we are able to refer most of the cases successfully, but sometimes it takes us calling, a dozen lawyers, law school clinics. We're getting a lot of law school clinics now to take some of these cases, and we've actually developed quite a few relationships with law school clinics, with the University of Maryland, for example, but also with American University's Law School Clinic, and a bunch of others. But we need private lawyers to step up and take some. So it would be awesome if you wanted to consider taking a case or two, and particularly a workplace, a health and safety or a wage case. Is that helpful?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, on a national level, is there legislation about better provision for fees and specific causes of action and all that stuff?
I mean, I think with respect to fees, no. I think that's a sad state of affairs, but like with the comp work, a lot of that is state-based, and things don't look so great in most states with respect to fees in comp cases. And, FLISA, the Fair Labor Standards Act, does provide for attorney's fees in these cases. So the wage claims are a little bit easier to refer out, particularly if they're large employers. But, on other sort of statutes that might have fee provisions or provide for attorney's fees, we haven't really seen anything positive on that front on the national level for a long time, at least. Anything that I can remember being positive.
With ag jobs, that's a new expanded version of H2A that was crafted with farm worker justice and labor advocates as well as industry people and others. They do have access to the federal courts, I know, which is different than they have now. So, but I don't think there's anything for fees. No.
Well, yeah, it's complicated because they do have, the ag jobs provision, like the ag jobs bill is like constantly kind of getting tweaked, and this may have fallen out, but there was a provision. What ag jobs is, and maybe I should let David finish explaining this, but is a bill that would be sort of an earned legalization program. So farm workers in the United States who could prove that they have worked in agriculture for a certain number of periods over a certain period of time could continue working in the United States if they continue to work only in agriculture and proved that they were working in agriculture for a certain number of years. And if they did that, then they could eventually get residency. A lot of folks who were negotiating ag jobs were really concerned about the fraud issues that happened with IRCA in 1986 when there was legalization, and so they included provisions in the ag jobs bill that workers could only submit their paperwork through certified agencies. And these certified agencies could potentially be eligible for some kind of funding to help facilitate the paperwork process. And the idea is that these certified agencies will be legal services organizations rather than notaries or some church groups that very well intentioned but were overloaded, I think, with the IRCA, and there was a lot of
QEDs, they call them.
Yeah.
Qualified designated entities.
Yeah. So there's a possibility for funding from that, but that's where things would come in. But no one knows what's going to happen with ag jobs, and today or this week we've got folks from labor talking to Chamber of Commerce and thinking about hashing out something new, and we've got there's a crazy guest worker bill, H2A bill that was promoted last week, and next week there's going to be a briefing on the Hill about another potential changes to H2A, and so ag jobs stands the most chance because it was after years of negotiation and had the support, at least for a while, of most of the major farm worker groups. like Flock and UFW and Farm Worker Justice, I think not the coalition, but most of the farm worker groups and most of the agricultural employer associations. And so it was a pretty carefully crafted negotiation. And then after September 11th, when was that again? What year? It pretty much fell off the table, but it keeps getting revisited and tweaked a little bit here and there. And each time it's tweaked, you lose a supporter, and it still has a pretty broad base of support, but quién sabe.
But in general, it's interesting that the policy stuff seems to be going more towards privatization of these guest worker programs and trying to get the government more or less out of it. And this is happening in Canada as well as the United States. And it seems like the provisions that are always come up and are pushed for with H2A is to make it more like H2B, which has fewer safety features in it. So it's it's really favoring capital when it comes right down to it. Rather than workers.
Yeah, no, for sure.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? I just want to have a chance to ask them.
Yeah, I was curious about sort of in relation to what you just said in terms of the debt that people have when they get here. I mean, because it seems like they're being charged for all kinds of different things in order to get here, and even once they're here. And I'm wondering, sort of, is there some knowledge about what the average debt that people have when they arrive, and how much of that is actually legal?
Well, that varies from community to community and country to country. I mean, they say that the Thai workers that come in, they're sometimes $12,000 in debt, but then Mexican and Central American workers are probably more in the hundreds, of dollars. They have to have money up front to cover their travel expenses, even though the employer is supposed to reimburse them for that. They need to pay for it first. They pay the contratista. They often pay to get their paperwork that's supposed to be paid for them again. In North Carolina, they pay the fee that's supposed to go to the Growers Association that the farmer is supposed to pay, but the farmer says, no, you pay that, and deducts it from their pay. And so, the debt can be substantial, but it varies. I mean, the debt's only $100, but in most cases, it's in the hundreds. And in the international, South Africa, China, Thailand are the three biggest growth industries in terms of sending guest workers around the world, not just to the United States and Canada, but also to Israel and a variety of other countries and the European Union. And in those cases, those people are going deep in debt and mortgaging their land and stuff like that to come.
Yeah, we did we're doing some surveys on recruitment issues, and particularly looking at sort of the whole recruitment process, but one of the questions we're asking is about fees, and we've done about 250 surveys about fees, and typically people are paying between $500 or $600 and $2,500. I mean, these are in Mexico though. They don't include surveys of Thai workers and Indian workers who were hearing stories of huge numbers. And I wanted to say a couple of things about the fees and what's legal and what's not. And then also Martin wanted to add something. He wanted to say that regardless of whether it's legal or it's not, workers in Mexico don't really know that there are fees that can't be charged. And so, people are typically willing to pay those fees. And, in Mexico, there is a law that prevents that requires bosses who recruit workers to work in another country to not only pay all the costs of recruitment, but also post a bond, register with the government. It's not enforced. And there really hasn't been a test case. We've done some analysis about potential test cases, and we're working with another organization to possibly bring one, but it hasn't been enforced. Other countries have similar provisions. Guatemala has one, Costa Rica has one, and typically, like across the board, they're not enforced. The U.S. Regulations, Homeland Security issued new regulations back in 2009, and those regulations actually do require that the employers don't charge any recruitment fees at all. But in practice, recruiters continue to charge fees. So I don't know if that helps. And then with respect to other expenses, there are certain provisions of law that require those fees to be reimbursed. For example, there's the Fair Labor Standards Act that protects our minimum wages, and courts consider that a lot of those recruitment expenses bring workers' wages below the minimum wage because they should be offset against workers' wages. I don't know.
We do only have like 1 more minute just to let everyone know.
I just wanted to add that wage theft is common in the fair and carnival industry, not just by the H2B workers, but really many of the workers in these occupations, and that the workers, the abused workers at the New York State Fair, had come from the county fair in Buffalo, in the Erie County Fair. And so that, part of, as an organizing strategy, what we're trying to do, and where student and faculty research help could be useful to us, is to sort of really figure out in New York State a model or strategy for addressing worker abuses at the county fairs, because you're all from some county somewhere, and the fair industry is just notorious for its abuse. It's not the most egregious and severe cases probably exist with the H2B workers, who can virtually be held in virtual slavery, really, in very challenging positions. But I think that's part of our vision of sort of figuring out these problems, is to these workers, there were literally hundreds of thousands of people who saw these workers but did not see their suffering, and it's kind of hard to, it's some of these abuses are hidden in plain sight. So if we can train ourselves to know what are the indicators of human trafficking and labor trafficking, if we can train ourselves to do that, then we can use our skills to stand in solidarity with the struggles of these workers.
It's a wonderful way to end today's session. Thank you, Pat.